Good vibrations.
Welcome to episode 142, and today I'm going to be talking all about reggae music and culture, its links to the Rastafarian religion, and the various manipulations and subversions that have taken place over the decades with this particular style of music. And when these have been present in every other genre, as we've discussed on many other shows, why would anyone expect it to be any different in this one, right? So my guest today is an author, lecturer, black cultural studies scholar who goes by the name of Dr. Rodney Shabazz. Welcome, brother.
Hey, greetings. Greetings, peace and love to the family. One love. I love Rastafari. Blessed.
Sure. Good to have you on. You got another name as well, R.A Ptahsen. I probably got that wrong.
It's all part of my divine revelation. It's Ra or R.A Ptahsen Shabazz. Yeah.
All right, but you're more commonly known as Rodney, right?
Call me. I prefer Shabazz is good, or Dr. Shabazz, Brother Shabazz.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
And it was Russ Ben that put me onto you. I was with that dude at the Free Your Mind conference in Philadelphia for the last 3 events. And he put in some fascinating presentations there on various different subjects. And I reached out to him saying that I wanted to do this show, and he put me on to you. So, yeah, big respect to Russ Ben.
Much respect to Russ Ben. Yes, I know you unlocked some minds.
All right, so you're the author of a book called Black to the Roots, Reggae's Rise, Downpression and Reascension. And I certainly want to get into different aspects of that today. Maybe you just want to spend a couple of minutes first off, though, giving people a bit of background as to what brought you to study these subjects.
Okay. Well, I'm born of Jamaican maternal heritage, but I'm born in the Bronx, New York, and raised by both my father and my mom. My father is from Harlem, New York, and in the household where I was raised, there was a strong love for musical culture brought by my father, as well as my grandmother, who's from Kingston, Jamaica. My mother was born in Kingston and came to New York when she was 13 in 1959. And as I grew up as a young youth in between the Bronx and Westchester, New York, I was really in search for my identity in the 1970s, 1980s, or I don't know if I was in search so much, but black identity was part of my particular raising. And so in my household, there was a strong musical culture in terms of soul and jazz. My grandfather is a jazz musician who left Jamaica in 1946 and actually played with the likes of Duke Ellington and Ray Charles, and he actually made his transition in London. He's Roy Burrows. I don't know if your audience would be familiar with Roy Burrows, a jazz trumpeter. Okay. But there was jazz and there was soul music, and in my youth there was a budding music that was coming out of Jamaica that was reggae music, and that music between my grandmother that lived upstairs, my nana that lived upstairs, and my father that just had a strong love for all things Jamaican. He created a big audio collection of reggae music, and between he and my grandmother, I spent hours listening to the music and reading the albums and really trying to really being influenced by the cultural identity and cultural awareness that was coming out of reggae music. In the 70s and 80s, at that time, as I was growing up in New York, hip hop and rap music was growing at that time, and I spent a couple of weeks in a rap crew, but all along I was listening in my Walkman to a lot of reggae music. And it created a strong influence on me that when I went to college in the 1980s, shortly before I went to college in the 1980s, there began to be mysterious and confusing deaths of these young and vibrant reggae artists that coincidentally were Rastafari artists and also artists that carried a strong political critique of the black people's position in a corrupted and expanding Western colonial global structure.
Well, I definitely want to get into the genre of reggae known as dancehall as we progress, which was known in the 90s as ragga and also goes by the name of bashment, because it seems there are many parallels there between what happened with reggae and the emergence of dancehall and what happened with hip-hop and the original styles that were present before the emergence of gangster rap and these different styles that changed the lyrical content and the production style of hip-hop. Some definite similarities there. But just going back to what you said there about these prominent artists who died untimely deaths, it always seems to be the ones who espouse positive messages in their music and who are politically active, who just happen to check out of this place early. Can't help noticing the pattern there. But just going back to the development of reggae, it seems before there was reggae, there was ska and rocksteady as these earlier styles before reggae emerged as the dominant style of music coming out of Jamaica towards the end of the 1960s. Would that be about right?
I think to properly look at the reggae tree, you also have to mention Mento music. Mento music was a country music. It was a country music that was associated with with the rural areas, and Mento music was a music that was kind of calypsonian as well as mixing some African elements with it, and it was a music that was used to make gesture and it was have topical songs that were with subtleties that were shrouded with meaning that we usually use to censor people in a West African style that might have been associated with the griot or the jele in West African traditions. But one thing about Mento music and particularly the time that was their existence was a colonial era. It was a British colonial era in Jamaica at that time, and so many of the Mento songs, they carried an anti-black ethos, an anti-black ethos that in one Mento song, there is a quote that suggests that the nigger man is a trouble, that the black man is a trouble, and so, but Mento would be part of the reggae genealogy, and I would also include the African rhythmic structure that was probably the drum structure behind much of the drum influence in Mento music, which it came from West Africa. And then out of Mento came ska. Ska was a merging of Mento with Mento with R&B influence as well as jazz influence, and so it was a trinity of musical genealogies that merged and combined in producing what became ska. And as ska emerged in the 1960s, there was a resurgence in anti-colonial and the human rights and quote unquote civil rights movement up in the Americas, and Jamaica itself was in the midst of its own independence in the early 1960s, and so ska was a music that also had a lot of social commentary to it, and those musics, Mento and ska, they merged, and the rhythm of ska slowed down in the later 60s and became rock steady, and then eventually rock steady had some kind of slight musical shifts that would redefine it as reggae, full blown by the late 60s, early 70s.
And the word is said to have been derived from a record by Toots and the Maytals called Do the Reggae, which came along in 1968.
Yeah, that's what I came across in my research. Although there was a show, a reggae video reggae video show that used to come on in the 1990s called Rockers TV by Earl Chin, hosted by Earl Chin, and he hosted some artists from Trenchtown who were claiming to originate the term as based upon a dance and a commentary about some movement in the dance that was referred to as Reggae. The man then was doing some Reggae type of movement, and that the word Reggae became associated with the dance, and that Toots and the Maytals popularized the term, as you say, that it became known as Do the Reggae, the dance.
So Rastafarianism is the de facto religion of reggae. It's completely synonymous with that music form, with the whole culture. And you could even make the statement that any artist wanting to be taken seriously within reggae kind of has to espouse those religious, spiritual doctrines. You know, it's hard to imagine any artist who is openly Christian or Muslim or Hindu being taken seriously in the reggae community, because it's all about the Rastafarian side of things. Maybe you want to fill us in on how Rastafarianism became so closely associated with reggae and how the two are effectively cultural cousins.
Sure, I can try. Well, Rastafari, and you know, one of the expressions in Rastafari, and you might even hear it in one of Bob Marley's songs. He says, "We're sick and tired of the ism and schism," and so never really refer Rastafari. Really, you know, the term "I" is very important in the ontology or the worldview of the Rastafari. Is the equalizing term, you know, and we could probably talk a lecture, an hour, about the etymology and the use of semantics and word sound and language in Rastafari. But yeah, the term Rastafarianism, it's a dissonance that I have with that term.
All right, so I need to refer to it as Rastafari from this point on.
Yeah, this Rastafari is man, it carries the vibration of the culture. But the Rastafari is a cultural movement that it's founded based upon it's founded based upon the ascension of Rastafari, King or Emperor Rastafari, as Haile Selassie I when he took the throne as Emperor Haile Selassie I in Ethiopia in 1930, and during that time there were Jamaicans that were abroad as well as in Jamaica, but particularly Jamaicans abroad that were part of the Garvey movement in Harlem. And in that Garvey movement in Harlem, there was a reverend from Washington, an African American reverend from Washington by the name of Reverend James Webb, and he was a Garveyite who wrote a book in 1919 entitled "A Black Man Will Be the Coming Universal King." And in that book, which became a play that they put on at Garveyite conventions, there was a quote in the play that said, "Look to Africa when a black king shall be crowned, for the day of deliverance is at hand." And so that book was written in 1919, and it was used at Garveyite conventions in 24. And so it became associated with Marcus Garvey, this prophecy the role that James Webb really plays in the revelation of Rastafari. And so in 1930, when Emperor Haile Selassie assumes the throne in Ethiopia, he also assumes the throne, you know, in ascending in a lineage that proclaims ascendancy from King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. And many Jamaicans and many Africans who were biblically bound and instructed at that time. They looked at Revelations chapter 5, verses 2 through 5, where it's proclaimed that one of the elders said, "Weep not, behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David, hath prevailed to open the book and to loose the seven seals." It seems to be a sign in Revelations, the end of the Bible, that this is marking the end of this current world. And so, just in the shifting of the racial dynamics of slavery and the movement of black people out of the 400-year bondage of slavery, and this reclaimed enlightenment that came through a re-examining an ancient past, and really re-examining the prophecies and the subtleties of the biblical tradition, and what the biblical tradition proclaims about Ethiopia and the Nile Valley from the Genesis through Revelations, and the proclamation that Israel is really rooted in Ethiopia that we see in the Old Testament. All of these revelations came to core and to the fore when, in 1930, prophecy seemed fulfilled when Haile Selassie the first took the throne. And so one of the leading proponents of making this connection between the Bible and Haile Selassie's historical ascension was a man by the name of Leonard P. Howell, and he was a Garveyite that had a business in Harlem, and it was a tea store, and eventually Howell, I think he became deported from the U.S. and returned to Jamaica in 1930 and became one of the first ministers, or one of the first men, not a minister, but one of the first men that would stand up on street corners, and proclaim this connection between Emperor Selassie and the Revelations 5 prophecy. And he recruited a following. A following became amazed behind his connections, and this following left whatever traditions that they might have been following in terms of Christianity, and began to proclaim that no longer were African people bound to the Queen of England anymore, and bound to pay taxes to Europe anymore, but that with this new revelation and this new insight and this new ascension of this African king of Ethiopia, that Revelations has been fulfilled, and this was a sign that the black people were now free to our own sovereignty. And so Leonard P. Howell, he created a commune in St. Catherine, Jamaica in 1940. And it was in Pinnacle. It was called Pinnacle in St. Catherine, Jamaica. And in that commune, the first Rastafari community was to grow. And, their traditions were largely based upon, and their musical traditions were largely based upon gathering around Christian hymns mixed with a Congo African drumming that was called kumina. And this kumina drumming would provide the early basis for what would become known as the Nyabingi drumming. That would be the early drumming of Rastafari culture. And this Nyabingi drumming would infuse itself early within the growth of the reggae music production industry, even during the ska era. That in the ska era, one of the first, if not the first ska record that was ever produced is a ska record entitled "Oh Carolina" by the Folks Brothers. I think it's a popular song even in England today.
That was done by
And
Shaggy, right?
it's redone by Shaggy,
Yeah.
but it was originally done by the Folks Brothers. And in the background on that early, it's a ska record, and on the background of that early ska record, you hear Count Ozzy. You hear Count Ozzy with some Nyabingi drumming, and the Nyabingi drumming is a slowing down of the African kumina drumming that was brought by Africans to Jamaica when slavery ended in Jamaica. And slavery ended in Jamaica in the 1830s, and Africans walked off plantations, they needed to fill those plantations still, and so they began to bring Africans from the Congo instead of West Africa, where the British were bringing most enslaved Africans to their colonies from at that time in the early 1800s. And so this is how Rastafari infuses itself early within the Rastafari cultural tradition, infuses itself early within this reggae music legacy as early as ska. And as ska grew, of course, we know one of the more popular ska groups were the Wailers at the time. Before they became known as Bob Marley and the Wailers, they were the Wailers. Bob Marley, Peter Tosh, and Neville Livingston, who became known as Bunny Wailer. And, they sang a song at that time in the ska era that kind of characterizes the ska era musically as well as lyrically. And that was a song called Simmer Down. Simmer Down, was a call to the youth of Jamaica to cool the temper and the frustration of the slow transition into independence that had many migrants making their way into Kingston, where there were expected opportunities, but few real ones to be found.
Okay, I want to get on to aspects of Bob Marley, Peter Tosh, and also Jacob Miller as we go on. But just staying with the Rastafari influence on reggae, that culture, that spiritual tradition seems to be a really curious amalgamation of different influences. So there's Old Testament biblical teachings that get referenced in there. There's obviously an emphasis on Afrocentrism and taking it back to African cultures with the Nyagimbi drumming and various other aspects. But there also seem to be elements of Judaism in there. There's references to Zion constantly. And when Haile Selassie was crowned Emperor of Ethiopia, he was referred to as King of Kings, Lord of Lords, Conquering Lion of the tribe of Judah. So there's all these different aspects and elements that have gone into the melting pot of how this cultural tradition, this religion came together.
Yes, if you really read the Bible with a strong awareness of ancient Nile Valley heritage and ancient African heritage, you would see that the African influence, as even depicted in the Bible with a close reading, shows that the African influences were beyond the continent of Africa itself in antiquity. That the Garden of Eden is said to have extended up into the Tigris and the Euphrates region, and that these ancient ones from that time were extending out of Ethiopia, which is also mentioned as part of the Garden of Eden. That the original human was black, and that if the original human was not black, then there would be no way to really speak of the black people being part of the human lineage, because there are no people that can produce the black people, but yet the black people have the DNA to produce all of the other people. This is to be found even within the biblical tradition, from Genesis, even through the prophecies and the testimonies of the Israelite prophets. That there's one particular verse, Amos chapter 9, verse 7, which reads, "Are ye not as children of the Ethiopians unto me, O children of Israel, saith the Lord." That a later Israelite prophet, Amos, even recalls that the Israelite tradition really extends from the Ethiopians. That the first 5 books of the Bible are alleged to be written by Moses, and Moses was born in the Nile Valley, raised in the king of Egypt's house, and he wedded an Ethiopian woman, and the 10 Commandments themselves are based upon 42 declarations of innocence that were part of the Nile Valley tradition that existed thousands and thousands of years before the Hebrew tradition was even to come into existence, mysteriously come into existence. And so the Bible is a loaded text, and its African influence is greatly unlocked through the proclamations of Rastafari reggae artists that used the song to in the spirit of Haile Selassie unlock the seven seals of humanity's consciousness to recognize the African role as the fathers and mothers of creation, as Haile Selassie was to be known as Earth's rightful rulers, and such a proclamation in the world that has seen the last 500 years of the African displaced and seen as the perpetual slave of the world. This was threatening a proclamation to become popularized through a musical art form such as reggae, coming from such a small island, former colonial subject, of the great British crown, So, that's I'm not sure if I'm touching on all of your question there.
Well, it's a deep and complex subject with many different strands to it for sure. Can you just explain what is meant by the references we constantly get in reggae lyrics to Babylon and Zion? So we hear those terms all the time. And also a couple of other phrases that crop up regularly in lyrics and in dialogue would be I and Jaja no. Can you just explain what's meant when we hear these?
If you can help me remember as we go through it, but Babylon is a reference to ancient Babylon, and ancient Babylon as a someone who teaches ancient history. Ancient Babylon comes from that region of Tigris and Euphrates, but ancient Babylon is not the most ancient culture of that region.
That would be the country that we know as Iraq today, right?
Iraq and Iran is where ancient Babylon was known as in yesteryear. But before it was known as Babylon, and of course that region is known as Mesopotamia. But in its most ancient reference as a cultural political entity, it was known as Sumer, and Sumer, Sumer, and the archaeological finds of the leadership of Sumer, as well as the culture of Sumer, reveals an Ethiopian origin. And so in Sumer, there was an invasion from the Eurasian steppes around 2500 BC under Sargon I. And it's what history shows us. And Sargon I made the testimony that I have defeated the black-headed peoples. Was a quoted testimony of Sargon I, and it speaks to the beginning of what I refer to as the Eurasian invasion from 2500 BC all the way to this day. There's been from the north to the south, from the west to the east. From the east to the west. This cultural invasion that came out of Eurasia and sought to displace and replace the indigenous black as well as matriarchal cultures that existed from ancient Sumer to ancient Harappa in India to the ancient Nile Valley to the whole ancient world that existed along that equatorial band, that expanded in antiquity into the Mediterranean and other places where the African world had expanded. But around 2500 BC, this Eurasian invasion took place, and Sumer was conquered by a culture that became known as Babylon. And so as Babylon cultured Sumer, began to culture it began to conquer other cultures as well, and becomes relevant to the Rastafari tradition through its conquering of ancient Israel. That Babylon conquered ancient Israel around the 8th century BC, and at that time, according to the heritage, it said that the Hebrew and biblical records of antiquity became destroyed and burned with the burning of Jerusalem and the burning of the cities of ancient Israel of antiquity by the Babylonian invasion. And at the end of that Babylonian invasion, really there became a reworking of a tradition that becomes known as the biblical tradition. That was a reworking of a tradition that was transposing ancient records, merging with Babylonian cultural political interest in what becomes known as the coded biblical tradition that we have today.
So Babylon is a term that's used to refer to an oppressor or an enemy or an adversary.
Yes, and particularly the Western or the Western Eurasian order that has taken over the cultural values of the planet Earth, and as it's a term that comes out of the Rastafari tradition, Rastafari tradition also affectionately is referred to as by one of the key houses of the Rastafari tradition that's known as the Nyabingi order or the Nyabingi house. And in that Nyabingi house, there's a proclamation that says death to black and white down presses. And so to really be part of the Babylonian spirit is to really be in cultural acceptance of really a cultural order that it's not racially coded, but culturally coded, if you will.
Well, it seems to me that Babylon is a term that could be used to apply to what people refer to as the Illuminati or the elite ruling class. It's different names that people put on basically the same groups here. We're talking the controllers of all of organized society.
Right. Yes. So that would be who is referred to by Babylon.
And Zion in this context would be a reference to Ethiopia?
Yeah, from a biblical tradition, I think you could argue that Zion would be Ethiopia, but you would have to read it. You would have to read it from a biblical psalmist, a reading of certain psalms, particularly the 87th psalm of the biblical tradition. And I'm tempted to quote it, but I would hate to miss a verse, But it speaks of it was a very popular verse that Rita Marley told me once that was Bob Marley's favorite psalm, and it says his foundations are in the holy mountains, and God loveth the gates of Zion more than all the dwellings of Jacob. So just to stop right there, that his or God's foundations are in the holy mountains. And of course, this speaks in terms of looking at the ancient and highlands of Ethiopia.
Right. The ceremonial smoking of marijuana is an important aspect of Rastafari. It's pretty much a requirement of any artist who wants to be taken seriously in the genre, I would say. And, there's different approaches to smoking weed. Some people do it just to get high, get blasted for shits and giggles, But when it comes to these traditions, it's an important religious, spiritual aspect of the culture. It's considered a portal to higher levels of consciousness and awareness and knowledge, and it's taken very seriously, right?
It's an important cultural component and I would say spiritual as well. But as we spoke about Leonard P. Howell being the founder of the Rastafari tradition in Jamaica, one of those first ones to make the proclamation that Haile Selassie fulfilled biblical tradition and that he was the returned Christ is what that the significance of that was suggesting. But when he created his commune and invited those that believed like he did to share a life together, one of the agricultural bases of their commune was the growing of marijuana. So they became major suppliers throughout the island of Jamaica of marijuana in the 1940s, and from that time, marijuana became associated with the Rastafari culture. However, Leonard P. Howard didn't bring marijuana to Jamaica. That East Indians who were brought to Jamaica during the same time at the end of slavery that I mentioned, when Central Africans were brought. Both of those groups were said to have cultivated a culture associated with marijuana. It was said to encourage work habits and those type of things. So both the East Indians that were brought, as well as Central Africans, both brought cultural influences associated with marijuana. The term is associated with India, but I think that the term kaya, for instance, is an African reference to marijuana that is sometimes used in Jamaica.
So, as we touched on earlier, there seem to be some very clear parallels between what happened with the corporatization of hip-hop when it was transformed from its original art form and lifestyle by the corporations, the white-owned corporations, into gangster rap and these different spin-offs where the lyrical themes were changed to embrace materialism, consumerism, bling, booty and bitches, talk of violence and gang banging and criminal lifestyles, replacing any kind of positive or uplifting message that was there before, and the direction that reggae music went in when you trace it from its roots and culture-centred themes of the 1970s to the emergence in the 1980s of the subgenre known as dancehall and all the slackness lyrics that were associated with it. Slackness was a term that was used to describe the sex and gun violence, which is the primary lyrical themes of dancehall music. It's sex and gun talk and very little else, actually. And to my mind, this cannot have been achieved by accident or random mutation. It was achieved by design and intent on the part of certain groups that felt that reggae was becoming too much of a galvanizing political force. It was uniting people. It was proving itself to be positive and motivational. And of course, the groups that control all of society can't have that. And when they see this sort of process starting to take place, they want to control it and subvert it and steer it off in certain desired directions. Maybe you could speak to how you feel about how this kind of process was achieved by the emergence of the dancehall genre in reggae.
Yes, indeed. Your reasoning was how I was scratching my head when I went to college and watching the transition. It was the same questions that I was asking myself, and that's kind of what led me. The book Black to the Roots is really based upon the dissertation that I wrote at Temple University, where I met Raspen. But it's interesting when you look at dancehall, because Bob Marley took about 9 years to produce 9 albums for Island Records. From between, I believe, around 1970, I'm sorry, I don't have the dates offhand, but around the early 70s to 1981, he produced about 9 albums for Island Records. But in the year 1982, the year after he was mysteriously to make his transition, this dance hall genre would become most popularized through one particular artist that was known as Yellow Man. Right. And Yellow Man, if you were looking at creating an artist to impact and affect, they picked the Yellow Man. They couldn't pick a more perfect artist. That Yellow Man Yellow Man in 1 year produced, I believe I recorded 9 or 10 albums in the year 1982, saturating the market with this new style of music that was really designed, as my book examines, to shift the movement of reggae into this new cultural element. That when you talk about hip hop and its transformation, hip hop's transformation is very much like soul's transformation. And when I was doing my research on reggae, I came across a book by called "The Death of Rhythm and Blues," "The Death of Rhythm and Blues" by Nelson George. And in that book, and in other points, other subtle points of research that you might find, they mention a Harvard University study that was released on May 11th, 1972. And this Harvard University study was sponsored by Columbia Records, which is CBS. And Columbia Records, or CBS, and Harvard University, they designed this study, released May 11, 1972, that was articulated with the intention to create or to examine methods to take control of black music and to take control of the black music market, the budding black music soul market at that particular time. And so this what we see take place in terms of the transformation of reggae music into dancehall, and what we see take place in terms of transformation of hip hop music and soul music. It all follows the CBS Columbia Records Harvard study, and this plan that they designed, that was designed for CBS, was designed for CBS to gain a strong percentage of the soul music market using several steps. One was to sign artists who have a message in the music, and this would allow CBS to consolidate the best music in the market. And using this greater, more elaborate marketing and distribution scheme, they designed to squeeze out black independent labels by buying up all the market space and all the shelf space, and not having any other labels be able to have access to sell their music.
Yeah, that all makes me think of the Sound of Philadelphia, the label that came from Gamble and Huff in the early 1970s, that was responsible for all that great Philadelphia soul, that whole genre that was very much of the time. I think that was a division of Columbia CBS Records as well, wasn't it?
That was part of their whole scheme, and their use of Huff Gamble was part of that scheme to create a transformation of the soul music market. That artistically, Huff and Gamble's music, solidified disco as the new genre that would replace soul, and disco became a very techno function music that took out of the play, allowed the acoustic artistry and the individuals that once were creating a living based upon the budding music market.
Yeah, well, that genre started out using orchestras with big string sections sounding really epic and quite beautiful before disco became more electronically produced towards the end of the 70s. But that Harvard report sounds very interesting and very key to study. And isn't it interesting that it came out on May 11th, 1972, which was 9 years to the day before the death of Bob Marley?
Yeah, I make some of those points. Indeed. Exactly 9 years before that date.
And it was also the day before my birthday.
Wow, you're born that day as well.
Well, I was born on the 12th, between the death day of Bob Marley and the birthday of Stevie Wonder, on the same birthday as Burt Bacharach.
What time?
So, when it comes to reggae and dancehall music, there are many artists who appear to have a foot in each camp. So they'll make dancehall music and you'll hear it ringing off in the clubs, very much in that style. But they're also known for coming with conscious tunes from time to time. So I'm thinking of names like Beanie Man, Buju Banton, Lady Saw, Tanya Stephens, Capleton, these kind of names. Do you get the impression that these artists are being allowed to express themselves through their conscious music, so long as they play the game by creating the dancehall output as well, that they're instructed to do this stuff by their record companies, and it's kind of a carrot that's dangled there. So if they make the style of music that suits the corporations, they can express themselves the way they feel to occasionally as well.
That's exactly the impression that I get, and I find that they find themselves caught in the valley of decision, and in some ways under the very judgment that some of their songs are criticized. That one particular artist that I'm sometimes disappointed by, or would be even Anthony B, and some of his mixed messages that I see coming from his artistry. On some songs, he presents a very strong cultural image of himself, as well as the African woman. And then on other songs and other videos, we see a more degenerated view of the reggae woman as the degenerated dancehall queen, from the roots reggae queen to the degenerated dancehall queen, is what we see in a transformation in many ways of the black woman and woman's position, even in the reggae music market. That once upon a time there was even a more elevated and ascended representation of womanhood in dance, in reggae, that we saw in the likes of Marcia Griffiths and Judy Mowatt, and of course Rita Marley. But even as we look at the presentation of the majority of popular dancehall women today, it looks more like you're looking at a strip runway show than a presentation of a self-thought conscious cultural projection.
And I get that with Beanie Man too. He's put out many records in the dancehall style, mostly about sex, lyrically, when you get down to it. But every now and again he comes with some conscious material as well, such as with the album Many Moods of Moses that he put out. So you get mixed messages from many of these artists.
Yes, indeed. And even at that time, I witnessed a clash between Beanie Man and Capleton about the representation of Rastafari in the music market, and it was actually at a dance hall presentation in New York City where Capleton rushed a set that Beanie Man was on, and proclaimed that he didn't want this type of man to lead the Rasta reggae movement, and so it was squashed and quieted very quickly, but there was at that time a dissension, and I don't see such battle between the ranks today as was at that particular time, and that was in the mid '90s. But I don't see that type of dissension today. Today, most times when you go to a show, you see artists of all likes participating in a more unified projection. But for a culturally adept and a listener, it does seem to raise contradictions in the presentation.
Yeah. I just want to spend some time talking about a dude who I've heard you reference on previous broadcasts. And when it comes to the development of reggae, he becomes very key, as does the label that he was proprietor of. We're talking Chris Blackwell, who was the owner of Island Records, the home of Bob Marley and many other influential artists. He becomes an interesting character to study. So Chris Blackwell was born in Westminster, London on the 22nd of June 1937. From his biography, we find he was the son of Joseph Blackwell, coming from the family responsible for the Cross and Blackwell food brand, known for baked beans and all that good stuff. His mother was Blanche Lindo Blackwell. She was a Costa Rican-born Jamaican heiress. His mother's family, the Lindos, were of Sephardic Jewish heritage. So his mother, Blanche, was an inspirational muse to Ian Fleming, the creator of James Bond, who himself had quite an attachment to Jamaica. He had his house Goldeneye on the island. He was very much a part of the British colonial presence in Jamaica, and also Noel Coward. And Blanche is said to have been a mistress to Ian Fleming, and according to some, to have been the inspiration for some of the more memorable female characters in the James Bond stories, such as Pussy Galore and Honeychild Ryder. So Chris Blackwell himself was a major in the Jamaica Regiment, so we've got a military connection there. Blackwell spent his childhood in Jamaica. He was sent to Britain to continue his education at Harrow. He decided not to attend university and returned to Jamaica to become an aide to the Jamaican governor, Sir Hugh Foote. And we get this classic anecdote told that in 1958, Chris Blackwell was sailing off Hellshire Beach. His boat ran aground on a coral reef, and he was rescued by Rasta fishermen who restored him back to health. The experience is said to have given Blackwell a spiritual introduction to Rastafarianism, and it was key to his connection to the culture and the music, so the story goes. So this guy comes from a very privileged establishment, white, middle-class British background, and is very influential in the way the story of reggae music plays out. This has led to a suspicion among many people that he may have been placed into that position, particularly given his military connections, to have a controlling effect on the music and the culture. Just be interested in your feelings on this dude and what his real role may have been.
Yeah, that what you read about his background is what my research revealed. In terms of the progression or evolution of the market, he would be central in terms of sealing the deal with Bob Marley. What is interesting about the deal that he did secure with Bob Marley when Bob Marley was stranded in Europe by Danny Sims and Johnny Nash. He was writing music for Johnny Nash at that time, and something went awry in their relationship, and the Wailers became stranded and sought out Chris Blackwell and Island Records at that time, and at that time Island Records was producing rock, but sought to bring them on. But what is interesting is that in order for Chris Blackwell to have rights to seal a deal with Bob Marley, he would have to buy out a contract that even CBS had already established with Bob Marley, and that Danny Sims and Johnny Nash were actually black CBS affiliates that had signed and had identified Bob Marley even before the world became aware of him. What has been written about and said about Chris Blackwell is very much in alignment with the whole political control of reggae music, and that even when we see that Bob Marley made his transition, Chris Blackwell was quick to try to use his transition as a death knell of reggae music as a whole. That Steel Pulse, a popular England-based reggae band that was very strong and charging at that time when Bob Marley made his transition. They were shocked. They were shocked when they found out that Island Records and that Chris Blackwell had no interest in further producing them as well as producing reggae, and that they at that time they tried to transition the reggae market into a ska market once again. And so
the accusation you get from many different quarters when it comes to Chris Blackwell is that he's some kind of gatekeeper.
Very much.
To keep an eye on the way the culture would progress and to make sure that it occurred within certain parameters.
Yes, Lee Perry wrote a very intriguing song about Chris Blackwell. I think it's entitled "Chris Blackwell is a Vampire." I don't think it gets too much radio play, but in that particular song, if one in narrative, in clear narrative, he associates Chris Blackwell with the attempted assassination on Bob Marley in Kingston in 1976. Very, very interesting song to listen to, and Lee Perry, as well as Bob Marley's former manager as well. Very scathing things to suggest about Chris Blackwell.
Are you familiar with a British reggae DJ by the name of David Rodigan?
I am.
Yeah, so, from some people you get the same accusation that Rodigan is some kind of gatekeeper as well. You can look at the backgrounds of Chris Blackwell and David Rodigan. They're quite similar in some respects. They both come from quite privileged middle-class white backgrounds. They both have military family connections. In Rodigan's case, he was a trained actor, went to public school.
I've always felt that way as well. Siaga, Chris Blackwell, as well as David Rodigan. Siaga, as we know, the former Prime Minister of Jamaica before he became Prime Minister, he was a cultural minister that was assigned to the very area that the budding reggae music was being created in the 1960s. And so from its very inception, the former colonizer, the former slave master, who at once upon a time in certain plantations, made it illegal for Africans to create music. That as this music began to be created in Jamaica, the political challenge to the Western world was early recognized, and the movement to transform it, was on reggae music from its inception, it seems.
And you might ask whether it's a natural kind of career progression for guys with these kind of backgrounds and educations to end up as proprietors of a reggae record label and as a prominent reggae DJ going out there doing sound clashes and all this kind of stuff. You might think that somebody with that kind of background would be more likely to end up as a business leader or in banking or finance or education or some kind of government post rather than the roles that they ended up in.
I can see that point. Indeed. Yeah. I can see that point. Yeah. I definitely recognize that one.
So just to talk a little about Bob Marley, the most influential reggae artist of all time, when it comes to the manner of his untimely demise, how much truth is there in the rumour that constantly gets put out there, this anecdote that gets told, of him having been given a pair of boots as a gift by a filmmaker by the name of Carl Colby, who turns out to have been the son of the one-time CIA director, William Colby. So you hear this story that Colby accessed Bob Marley's compound in Jamaica where he was living after the assassination attempt on him at the end of 1976. And according to some versions of the story, The boots that were offered as a gift were football boots, and in other versions of the story they were a pair of cowboy boots. But either way, the consistent point is that when Bob Marley put them on, he cried out in pain, and there's supposed to have been a piece of copper wire that pierced his toe. And of course, a few years later, we get the story that he's died of this rare form of cancer that spread through his toe. He broke his toe when he was playing football, and that's supposed to be how this whole thing went off. How much truth is there from research that you've done in this story of how this cancer came to enter his body?
I can't tell you the truth of anything, my friend, but what I've seen is I've seen the idea that Bob Marley stuck his foot into a gift of a boot or something that was given to him. But when first I read it, I don't think it was associated with Carl Colby. It was a gift that was given to him by a journalist, but I didn't read it as Carl Colby at that time, and that he did exclaim "ouch" and notice that there was something awry in the boot. And I did. Right, exactly. Then, it would be later that I would hear that Carl Colby is being associated with that. My first real critical view of Carl Colby was really in looking at the footage that was taken when Bob Marley was exiled after the assassination attempt was made. That the footage for that concert, was very rare footage, but you can watch it on YouTube today. But it's footage that's taken on stage by a cameraman. It must have been Carl Colby or whoever he was there with, whose name I can't recall. But yeah, that when Bob Marley is in the mountains in Chris Blackwell's mountain estate, supposedly under protection, that this camera crew, is able to film Bob Marley, and they film him even on his way down the mountain to pick up Rita Marley at the hospital because she had been shot in the scalp and decided to come and play the concert. And so, they even give Bob Marley walkie-talkies to communicate to Rita Marley, with which, must have been, aligned with the CIA or whatever undercover agency that had them under their espionage at that time. And so, yeah, that's really my look at Carl Colby in terms of his I think that he might have been contaminated with something at that time, and then I think that they were really trying to make him self-deface himself. They wanted him to amputate his toe, and they put him on a different regimen in terms of diet and things of that nature. But I've a comment by Rita Marley that I kind of give a lot of have a lot of resonance with, and that she says that she doesn't really even believe that Bob Marley ever had cancer. And that when he is finally put to a career-ending place with the disease, it actually takes place in New York City after he performed at Madison Square Garden. He's taking a jog in a park and has a seizure. I kind of, as I look at the research and I put the videos together, I kind of believe that he was drugged, and that seizure was part of him being drugged, and that there were agents that influenced him to be rushed to Sloan Kettering, where immediately he was told that he had a short time to live and was put under radiation, and I think at that time under some type of experimentation, Western scientific experimentation.
Yeah, well, whatever the method, it seems pretty clear that he was knocked off one way or the other by the agency.
Well, definitely that he would end up under the care of ex-Nazi doctor.
Yeah, Dr. Joseph Issels.
missiles as well, and it's just the circumstances that were surrounding him, and the movements that he was to make at that time, as well as when we look at the whole world of the drug industries and the drug warfare. Say it again.
Big pharma, pharmaceutical cartels.
But even beyond the pharmaceuticals, I'm talking about the agencies and their use of drugs to kill certain political targets, and South Africa's agencies were revealed to be in correspondence with U.S. agencies, and they were producing all sorts of agents that could be used in cigarettes and candies and all sorts of places. And
I did an interview with an author and researcher by the name of John Potash recently. He's got a book and a film called Drugs as Weapons Against Us, and he goes into the many different ways that the CIA and FBI and other agencies have used drugs to neutralize certain political activists and artists that have become a nuisance. They weaponize the whole thing.
Yes, you're more conversant than I am. Then.
So Peter Tosh, another influential and politically active artist, was taken out in some quite suspicious circumstances in 1987 when the house he was in was descended upon by these attackers who just murdered everyone in sight. Seems to me to have been another artist who'd become a bit of a loose cannon, a bit unpredictable, a bit of a pain in the neck, who'd been neutralised and taken out one way or another, the way it so often seems to happen.
Yes, and his what has been termed by some, his execution was also on a dubious date, which is September 11th, 1987. But at his whole career, was a committed testimony to the Rastafari ideal, with the removal of Bob Marley, his voice was the most strident voice in terms of a critique, the Rastafari critique through reggae music of the Western world, and it's very interesting that when we look at his last album is entitled No Nuclear War, and on that album, he seems to be taking on both of the Western powers as he stands on a Russian and U.S. missile. And listening to the lyrics of that album, the whole defense of the legalization of marijuana, as well as the critique of the political movements of the Western world, are very strong and consistent as throughout his career. It seemed clear that the person that was found guilty of murdering was beyond reasonable doubt, and I've heard a sad rumor that gentleman has been released even from death row in prison. Even to this day, I think that he was released years ago. The man that was to kill Peter Tosh.
Another artist I've heard you talk about on previous broadcasts would be Jacob Miller, originally with the group Inner Circle. He died in 1980 in a car crash alongside his son at the age of 27, interestingly. So he's another member of the infamous 27 Club, these musicians that always seem to pass away in mysterious circumstances at that particular age. He just returned reportedly from a visit to Brazil with Chris Blackwell and Bob Marley. What more can you tell us, and what more is there to know about Jacob Miller?
Jacob Miller was a young, strident artist, and as you mentioned, at that time of his death, he and Bob Marley, they were close already, and they seemed to be teaming up and planning a South American reggae tour. And Jacob Miller is one of the stars of the roots reggae film entitled Rockers. That might be of interest to your audience. Rockers is a reggae music that was a reggae film, a film about roots reggae artists that was highly constructed by the artists themselves in 1977, I think it is, and it shows the trials as well as the lifestyle and the cultural beliefs of the Rastafari artists that were budding at that time. Jacob Miller is one of the stars of that film, and one gets to see his personality, which was a very happy and jovial personality. Well, he and Bob Marley and Chris Blackwell, they had just returned from a tour to create a reggae tour in South America in the late 70s, early 80s. And as Jacob Miller was leaving Bob Marley's house, Island House, which he purchased from Chris Blackwell, which became his studio home. As Jacob Miller was leaving his home, he met his demise in a car crash. And I don't know of any. I never saw, and I don't believe that there were any examinations of the conditions of the car. Recently, there was a very interesting documentary that was done regarding a soul artist by the name of Teddy Pendergrass here on one of the cable shows here in America. Are you familiar with Teddy Pendergrass?
Yeah, he was one of the Philadelphia international artists.
Yes, very. And so in this documentary, it talks about his demise was, similar to Jacob Miller's in many ways. That he met his musical career came to almost an end, although he made a comeback, but largely was shut down when his Rolls Royce crashed around a corner on a parkway in Philadelphia, and as this documentary was examining and talking to various interviews, it was making mention that most of Teddy Pendergrass's cars were known to have problems with the brakes, that the brake lines were known to be cut on Teddy Pendergrass's car. And the same question that I would have to ask regarding Jacob Miller's car accident, although since the time of my research and publishing the book, I've heard the explanation given that had something to do with a sugar cane stick, that the sugar cane stick had been caught in the driver's wheel, is what Lee Horsemouth Wallace said was the explanation for the car crash. But Jacob Miller, nevertheless, became a very lost voice in the projection of roots reggae at that time, and his would be the first of the reggae artist trinity or first of four artists. Him, Bob Marley, Jacob Miller, Bob Marley, Hugh Mendel, as well as Peter Tosh would be four young artists, budding roots reggae, strong, committed, culturally political reggae Rastafari artists that would mysteriously die in that period of the 70s to the 80s, and their mysterious deaths would clear a way that would influence a transition, ease a transition from the roots reggae popularization of reggae to the dancehall reggae popularization that has now taken over the reggae market even up to this day.
Yeah. Never seems to happen with Sean Paul and Mr. Vegas, and people like that. They're always just fine.
Well, prayerfully, they stay fine, but yeah.
Well, yeah, of course. My point is just that artists who espouse political messages and seek to uplift with their music always seem to be the ones that just happen to get cancer and die in car crashes and things like this, whereas the artists who promote corporate agendas and make mainstream music and adhere to blueprints and stuff are always just fine. You never hear of any kind of problems emerging with them, for as long as they carry on doing it, at least.
Well, we even have to watch on the popularity, even of the popular ones, because even the popular artists become targeted for removal for whatever benefits, financial benefits that might accrue someone by their absence. You know, to think about Prince and Michael Jackson, or even Sam Cooke or Otis Redding or Whitney Houston, and to be a musical artist, few artists really recognize, you know, the political terrain that they're involved in when they get involved in this in that world. But yeah, it's clear to see once it's examined with a critical eye.
Sure. All right, brother. Well, we're approaching the close of the chat now, but in parting, do you just want to leave listeners with any observations on where you feel the reggae scene is headed, and maybe some optimism, some uplifting words in terms of encouragement that's to be drawn from the way things are panning out, and just some parting final thoughts to leave people with generally?
Yeah, I'm grateful for the opportunity, you know, just to share in a reasoning about such an important art form, and as really my book examines and tries to highlight, is that this is an art form that's an expression of a cultural idea that has really been under challenge for the last 6,000 years, and will probably be under challenge for perpetuity, even greater challenge in the years to come, until those artists that are involved in it, you know, really recognize the stakes that are at hand, and really begin to create our own sovereign markets, and protections, you know, so that the sustenance and the continuance of this music can be created and protected to advance the lives and the interests, you know, of those that are being inspired to produce it. That until we become more conscious, particularly as Black people who are part of the world of entertainment, you know, whether it be music or sports, or, you know, whatever the role of entertainment that we are involved in the Western world in this day, you know, we will forever be pawns in someone else's movement until sovereign steps are made to sustain, you know, the own sanctity of our expressions, of our cultural expressions, which are inspirations that are given to us to guide humanity toward what was once at the beginning and prophesied to be once more at the end, a new beginning. Yeah, man. So that's what I would share.
And do you just want to let listeners know where they can get hold of a copy of your book? And also, are there any other aspects of your work that you'd like to promote at this point?
I appreciate love it. And this is it's my one book that I've produced at this time. And you can find it at blacktotheroots.net. That's BLACKTOTHEROOTS.net, blacktotheroots.net. And yeah, I appreciate love the support. And if you might even connect me to a British market that might host the book, that would be a great support to me as well.
All right, Dr. Shabazz, thanks for coming on the show today.
Grateful for the opportunity, Brother Devlin. Yeah, man, keep up the great works. Look forward to hearing from you.
This is just for fun.
Vibrations, I'm picking up. Vibrations, I'm picking up.